Hello and welcome back. This is the week 5 lecture. So today I would like to start on The Coquette by Hannah Webster Foster. This is our next major text, and I already provided a brief introduction to it last week when we were sort of moving through our history lesson, and I was talking about the era of the early republic or the early national period. So we covered a lot of ground last week. We kind of worked our way through some important text from the colonial period, and then we worked our way up to the end of the 18th century. So really, we were talking about some of the first texts to ever be published in the newly independent U.S. So that's where we start today. We're going back to the 1790s. And I want to talk a little bit about The Coquette itself, but I'm actually going to save most of my material on the novel for next week because we are spending 2 full weeks on this book. So here in week 5, I would like to spend most of my time sort of contextualizing this text, giving you some background and talking a little bit more about the sentimental novel genre. I talked about it a little bit last week, but I didn't get into as much detail as I wanted to. It might have been enough for your taste, but this week I want to talk a little bit more about the history of the novel in the English language tradition and the really important role that sentimental novels played in that history. So you have to understand, before we can really get into The Coquette, we have to understand that this is an early novel. It's not just an early American novel, although it very much is. It's just an early novel in general. Novels in English had only been around for about maybe 70 or 80 years prior to the publication of The Coquette. Now, of course, it's a little bit difficult to pinpoint a specific date as far as the advent of the novel. Some people will claim that there are some various ancestors of the modern novel and predecessors that we can talk about, and we will cover some of those potential ancestors and predecessors here today. But just in terms of what we think of as modern novels written in English, I mean, the history really begins in the early 1700s in England. So we're still in the early stages of this development, this larger historical process here with The Coquette. So I want to spend some time on that today, and I want to see some of the ways in which The Coquette is participating, not just in early novel production, but also in the ways that people read fiction. This book is participating in a really important sea change in terms of readership and notions of fictionality and how we understand fictional characters, how we understand the things that we read. So there's a lot of important stuff going on here that I want to start with here today. And then next week, we'll talk a little bit more about the plot. We'll talk a little bit more about some key themes here in the actual novel, but I will get to some of that today towards the end of lecture. But let's start with a little bit more of this history, since a lot of this should be fresh in our minds after last week. So we kind of left off last week in the 1790s, and we were talking about some books like Charlotte Temple, The Power of Sympathy by William Hill Brown, which has the honor of being the first American novel published really ever, because it was published in 1789, I believe. So historians mark that as the first novel published after the ratification of the Constitution. So this kind of marks the beginning of our national history on a lot of levels, and that includes our national literary history. So I mentioned The Power of Sympathy last week in our historical survey, and I pretty much told you guys, look, we're not going to read it. And William Hill Brown was a bad writer. He was a hack writer. The novel is bad. I would never subject people to that novel, but it does serve an important sort of historical role. It is an important historical footnote, but for us, that's all it is. But it's an example of a sentimental novel based on true events, and it's also a seduction tale. So as I told you guys last week, the sentimental novel genre, that category, is a little bit hard to define, and it's very broad. So I'll just kind of give you a working definition that we can use for now, but I want you to pay attention to the wording of this definition. I did not come up with this myself. I found this years ago when I first taught the coquette. I found this definition in some dictionary of literary terms. In fact, I think it was this book here, which I often use to define terms, a handbook of literature. This has been around since like the 50s, and we keep getting new editions. So this is like kind of a traditional definition of the sentimental novel genre that we can work with. Broadly speaking, this term can refer to any novel that exploits the reader's capacity for tenderness, compassion, or sympathy to a disproportionate degree. I want us to chew on that definition a little bit. I'm very intrigued by some of the word choice. But if we just think about what does it mean to be sentimental? Sometimes this word does have some negative connotations in our society. So to be sentimental, the definition of that word, to be sentimental, is to be susceptible to feelings of tenderness, sadness, and nostalgia. But we often wrap sympathy up in that. Go back to the William Hill Brown novel, The Power of Sympathy. So the way sentimental novels were often thought of is that they were books that really tapped into readers' emotions. And that sounds pretty neutral, but as we can see in this definition, there's a little bit of negativity associated with this genre and with these emotions. So go back to the definition that I just read. These are novels that exploit the reader's capacity for tenderness and sympathy. That's an interesting word choice, exploit. That has negative connotations. We could put it a different way. We could say that these novels tap into these emotions, or they access those emotions, or they activate those emotions. But to say that they exploit those emotions is it sounds a bit judgmental to me. It sounds a little bit bad or subversive or transgressive in some way. And then at the end of the definition, we hear that these novels are tapping into our capacity for sympathy, tenderness, etc., to a disproportionate degree. So again, a little bit judgy. It sounds like we're kind of finding fault with these novels. They're too emotional. They're making readers feel a disproportionate amount of emotion, which is kind of a weird thing to say. So this is important for us to consider because this is very much a part of sentimental novels, and at least the way that they are still thought of, the way that they are still classified and discussed. For a long time, they were sort of segregated, kept apart from what would have been considered serious literature. Sentimental novels were thought to be lesser than, for a variety of reasons. And as I mentioned last week, a lot of it had to do with sexism and misogyny. This should not come as a shock to us as we're thinking about the 1790s and just these older societies in general. But sentimental fiction was often associated with women, either women characters, because the plots often revolved around female characters, though not always. That was not a hard and fast rule, but it was often the case. So we either had a lot of female characters, or in many cases, the books themselves were written by women, which is obviously the case with the coquette. But as we see with The Power of Sympathy, many of these authors were also men. So it could go either way, but that's how people often thought of sentimental novels. Oh, they're feminine. They're about feminine themes. They're about domesticity. They're about relationships. And back then, and you might argue that it's still kind of the case now, a lot of emotional states are often associated primarily with women. even though it's often not based on any real factual evidence, but this idea that women are more emotional. Women are more tender. Women are more compassionate. We haven't totally lost these ideas. I think we've advanced in some ways since the 1790s, but we haven't totally lost some of these conceptions. So for a long time, literary historians and scholars sort of neglected sentimental fiction, even though they knew full well how popular it was during its day. So I mentioned last week that Charlotte Temple, written by Susanna Rowson, another sentimental novel from the 1790s, it was the best-selling novel in America for roughly 60 years until another sentimental novel written by a different female author, Uncle Tom's Cabin, by Harriet Beecher Stowe, in the 1850s, finally surpassed it. So just think about that for a moment. The two most popular novels in America, in the antebellum history of America up until the Civil War, the two most important novels were both sentimental novels, both written by women. And for a long time, they were both ignored by a lot of historians and scholars who were like, yeah, they were popular. Yeah, they sold a lot of copies, obviously, but they're not art. They're not high art the way these other novels are. So we're going to navigate some of that as we move along this semester. I've already kind of mentioned this. We're going to eventually read Melville, Poe, Whitman, Emerson, some of these guys that were held up as the best writers of the 19th century, in many cases the best writers of all of early American literary history, and they were often held up at the expense of writers like Stowe, like Foster, like Rowson, who sold a lot more copies than those guys did, but because they wrote sentimental novels, they were often segregated, frankly, and sort of kept at a remove, kind of distant from serious scholarly consideration. Now that is changing. So if you guys got the edition that I ordered of the Coquette, I want you to read the introduction by Kathy Davidson. It's short, and it's really good. It will give you some helpful context, like I'm doing, hopefully, right now as well. But Davidson was one of the scholars back in the 1980s who really helped to kind of, for lack of a better term, sort of rediscover the Coquette and sort of bring it to the forefront of American literary study and kind of telling the rest of us, hey, this is an important book. Not just because it was part of a popular genre back in the 1790s, but because it has a lot of interesting things to say about American society in the 1790s. And yeah, it's also a representative of this really popular type of early novel. So we can approach it on both of those levels. And now we're gaining a greater appreciation for a lot of these sentimental books that were not studied as much as Melville or Whitman for a long time. But we are starting to change that. And like I said, we are starting to open up the canon and trying to include people that are not just white men. And that's an ongoing process. So we're definitely kind of doing a little bit of that now, because even to this day, a lot of American students don't really know this history, this 1790s early novel history, because it doesn't get taught as much as the stuff that comes a little bit later. So, okay, we've established that. So we know that sentimental novels are popular, and I talked about Charlotte Temple as a very popular example, the most popular, and it's an example of a seduction tale, as is The Coquette, as is The Power of Sympathy. So they're all kind of similar in terms of content, in terms of plot. And these novels were popular. This type of novel was popular both in England and the early U.S. So the plots were often very similar. They revolved around young women, oftentimes. If we're talking about the seduction plot, think of that as a subgenre of the larger sentimental novel genre. So within that seduction plot subgenre, we normally have young women who are very virtuous, very innocent, often beautiful. They have a lot of appealing traits, but they are essentially the objects of seduction attempts. They are being seduced by a specific character type referred to back then as a rake. So I think I mentioned this term last week. Just like the thing that you use to clean up the leaves in your front yard, the rake in this context refers to a man, usually a relatively young man, at least maybe middle-aged, but often wealthy, attractive, like handsome, possesses certain desirable traits, but is also a womanizer, sort of disreputable, often dishonest, and these rakes are trying to seduce these innocent young women. And different plots unfold in different ways. In some cases, the virtuous young woman overcomes the obstacles that she is facing, and she either avoids the rake and marries a wholesome, respectable man, or in some cases, she might reform the rake. Perhaps the rake changes his ways because he falls in love with her. But then there's another possibility that we see play out in Charlotte Temple, in which the young woman falls victim to the rake, and she is seduced. And oftentimes she'll become pregnant. The man will leave because he usually has no real intention of marrying her or sticking around after he's had his fun. So the woman will have a child out of wedlock. She will be shunned by her society as a result of that. And then oftentimes the young woman dies. That is another common ending of a seduction plot. So these were very common, and we can find these going back to the very beginning of novel writing in the English language, which, like I said, really goes back to the early 1700s. So we are in the late 1700s here. So we're still in these early stages, these early days of English language novels. So that brings me to a little brief history lesson. I'll try to keep this brief. As you guys can tell, I'm really kind of interested in a lot of this stuff. I'm a bit of a literary historian just in terms of my own training and my own experience. So, and I don't get a ton of opportunities to talk about this in other classes. So I sort of overdo it at times, perhaps. So I'll try to limit the history here, but we do need to understand some of this to, again, have a better sort of complete picture of the world that the coquette exists in. Because one really cool thing, I think it's cool, is that people had to learn how to read novels. In terms of like human history, novels are young. Novels are a relatively recent development. So if we're thinking about like older forms of literature, if we think about the traditional genres of literature, really novels and short stories have not been around as long, not nearly as long as poetry and the theater, which both have roots in ancient cultures. But novels didn't really develop in the Western world, in the English-speaking world, until the 1700s, and then short stories didn't really develop in the English-speaking world until the early 1800s. So compared to those older forms of literature, novels and short stories are really the new kids on the block. But there is an older tradition of what we might call prose fiction. So most of you guys probably know the basic distinction between verse or poetry and prose. We typically find prose in short stories and novels, and of course it does not read the same as verse. It does not have a meter, it does not usually have a rhyme scheme, and it sounds a little bit more like the way people actually talk. So prose has been around for a long time. It's not like everything was written in verse back in older times, but there really weren't novels as we would define them. There were other kind of older forms of prose fiction. So if we go back to like the Middle Ages in Europe, we'll find a lot of sort of ancestors of modern day prose fiction. So things like fables, fairy tales, some of these things haven't gone away. Some of these texts are still with us, perhaps in modified forms. But a lot of fairy tales or legends would have been written in prose. Sometimes they might have been written in verse, and sometimes they were even sung or performed with musical accompaniment. But in other cases, they would have been written in prose. So it's a little bit similar to what we would see with novels today. And in the medieval times, in sort of Western Europe, a particularly important and sort of popular genre of prose fiction was the romance. So just indulge me here as we talk about the romance for a moment. I don't mean like a romantic comedy like the way we would define it today, like boy meets girl, they live happily ever after, but an older usage of that word. The romance in the medieval period would have been a sort of fanciful narrative, often involving knights and damsels in distress and dragons and sorcerers and some kind of a quest, a hero's quest. And you'll know, of course, that we haven't lost those things entirely in our contemporary popular culture. A lot of those elements sort of are still very much in existence in contemporary fantasy fiction, in that genre of literature. But, there's a really old history, and this was a popular type of text, in the pre-modern world. So these were fanciful stories. Again, these involved supernatural elements, sort of mythological warriors. They were also very steeped in chivalry. So sometimes they were called chivalric romances because they often involved knights saving ladies, damsels, members of, the nobility. And there was kind of a formula. So if any of you have read Don Quixote, which is often considered maybe the first modern novel, obviously written in Spanish in the 1600s, that book is actually a satire, is kind of a commentary largely on chivalric romances because the main character spends all of his time sitting around reading chivalric romances, and they kind of poison his brain and they make him think that he's a knight going out there on adventures when in reality he's just kind of an ass. So I mentioned Cervantes and Don Quixote last week because Breckinridge in modern chivalry is so obviously influenced by that early novel. So chivalric romances were very popular in the Middle Ages, but they remained popular up until the early modern period. They were still popular in the 1600s. They were still popular in the 1700s. So there was a tradition of prose fiction. But we don't really start to see novels the way we define novels until the early 1700s. And what you have to appreciate about the literary scene back in the early 1700s is that people had to sort of adjust to this new style, this new genre of writing. There wasn't really a clear, direct precedent of the modern realistic novel. And that's the key word for us today, realistic. Because in a novel like The Coquette, it's very much plausible. It very much feels like events that could really happen, characters that we could really meet, and it's based on real events. So a lot of that is by design. But realistic fiction realistic prose fiction didn't really exist in the English language speaking world prior to the early 1700s, at least not in a really well-defined, systematic way. But another thing to keep in mind, as novels are developing, so are newspapers. So these are two historical developments that kind of run concurrently. So newspapers are also kind of taking on their modern form during the 1700s. So a lot of historians have pointed out that newspapers and novels, the modern realistic novel, they kind of developed alongside one another. And they borrowed techniques from one another. So a lot of early novels in the 1700s were written very much in the style of early journalism because they were trying to be realistic. They were telling plausible stories, much like the stories that one would find in a newspaper. So a lot of early novels were packaged, promoted, and sold as true stories. They were presented as real, even though they often were not. So there was this really confusing moment at this point in history as people are learning to read this new kind of literary genre. So I'll just give you an example. A lot of you are familiar with the book Robinson Crusoe, written by Daniel Defoe, an English writer. This is considered one of the first novels written in English. It was first published in, I believe, 1719. And it was presented to the public as a true story. So a lot of you are familiar with this story. Robinson Crusoe gets shipwrecked in the Caribbean. He ends up living on this desert island for quite some time. He eventually kills a lot of Native Americans. He acquires a slave and becomes somewhat prosperous in a weird way. But he's there for a long time, and he has all of these adventures. It's been turned into movies. It's been the subject of a lot of adaptations. So we know the story. But it first appeared as an early novel in 1719. And Defoe wrote several early novels in England. He was kind of a big part of this movement, and he presented most of his novels as true, including Robinson Crusoe. He claimed it was based on true events that he read about. But it really wasn't. I mean, very, very loosely. I mean, yes, there were a lot of other people who had been shipwrecked during that time period. Some survived, some lived long enough to tell their stories, but all of the specific events that happened in the novel were pretty much made up by Defoe. I mean, he wasn't really sticking very closely to any real or true accounts. So the presentation was a bit false, and readers kind of eventually figured that out a few years after the initial publication, largely due to newspaper reporting. And it was kind of revealed later that Defoe mostly made up the story. Like, most of it was not directly based on real events, even if Crusoe himself might be said to be loosely based on real people, but the key word there being loose, very loosely based. So once readers discovered that, a lot of them got kind of mad, and they felt a little bit cheated by Defoe. So this was the conundrum that a lot of early novel writers faced. Because as a lot of scholars have shown us, and I'm borrowing very heavily from a scholar named Catherine Gallagher, who has kind of done this history, and I had to read her as a grad student. So trust me, I'm only giving you a small piece of Gallagher's overall work because it's very comprehensive, but she shows that a lot of early novel writers really were sort of copying newspapers in terms of style and content, and they would package their novels as true stories because that's kind of what the public wanted. But at that time, the public did not have a conception for realistic stories that were also fiction. So if you sat down in 1719 to read a romance, you knew that it wasn't supposed to be real. You knew that the romance was totally fiction, that the dragon wasn't real, the sorcerer wasn't real, right? That wasn't hard to understand because they understood fanciful stories. This is a classification that Gallagher uses. She says there was fanciful prose fiction, like unrealistic, dragons, supernatural, mythological characters. So people recognized that. But when people saw realistic narratives, they assumed it was like a newspaper story. They assumed it was real. They assumed it was true. So early realistic novels kind of straddled this line between fiction and what we would call nonfiction. But those classifications hadn't been fully worked out yet at this time. So this becomes a little bit confusing for many readers and kind of for us as we try to understand this period in history. But one thing Gallagher talks about, and it's a really important concept that I want to introduce, it's this idea that she calls referentiality. It's a hard word to say, but it's an easy concept. Referentiality. Think about reading a novel today in 2021. Think about sitting down, reading a novel for pleasure, just a book that you like, We all know how to read realistic fiction. Now, not all fiction, of course, is realistic, but a lot of fiction is. A lot of popular fiction is. And we have no trouble navigating that kind of fiction today. So if we sit down today to read a realistic novel, we understand that the characters in that novel are not necessarily referencing or representing real people. We get that. Now, of course, in some cases they do, because in certain works of historical fiction, we do have real-life historical figures serving as characters, or we have characters that are very obviously based on real-life historical figures. So that's still a technique that's very much in use, but the majority of fiction is not written that way. The majority of fiction is purely fiction, and the characters aren't meant to be stand-ins for real people. And we understand that today. So the whole notion of referentiality and the importance of it is kind of hard for us to grasp because we understand it so implicitly already. Like, we don't need it to be explained to us. We don't need somebody to say, the protagonist in this book, he's not based on a real person. He's just a figment of the author's imagination. We know that. Like, we already know that. So we take this concept for granted. But as Gallagher says, in 1719, people didn't really know that. People would read a book like Robinson Crusoe and be like, oh, this dude's real. What a bunch of crazy things that happened to him. Because even though that book featured a lot of adventures, a lot of improbable events, it was still presented in a realistic way. It wasn't a romance. It wasn't a fable. It wasn't a poem, right? It read like a newspaper article. It was realistic. Crusoe was like a regular person. He wasn't a medieval knight. He wasn't a mythological hero. He was just a regular guy. He got hurt a lot. He didn't know everything. Now, of course, he did triumph in many ways, but he has to kind of do trial and error. He kind of has some setbacks. So it was all presented as realistic, as plausible, which back then made people think must be true. So as the decades passed, this became a little bit easier to understand and navigate, but still a lot of novels continued to be presented as true stories, as a way to, entice readers. So there was always this fine line, and if readers found out that the novel was heavily fictionalized, they would often be a little bit upset, or they might feel a little cheated. So to turn back to these early sentimental novels, a lot of them were sort of ripped from the headlines. Many of them were based on true stories. And The Coquette is no exception. The Power of Sympathy also was based on a real-life scandal in 1780s Boston, featuring a kind of a minor American poet, her husband, and her sister. And her husband and her sister had an affair and ran off together. So this was very much reported on in the newspapers of the time. It was well known, it was well publicized. So Brown takes those well-known events and he uses them in his novel. And he's not a very skillful novelist. That's a big reason why we're not reading his book. So he doesn't even really change much. I mean, he changes their names so he wouldn't be sued for libel, but he keeps most of the events the same, and readers would have known very easily. They would have known that this is all based on the real-life scandal that had been, in all of the local newspapers. But even though he sticks pretty closely to the real events, he does change a few details, and he obviously changes the names. And because the newspaper reporting wasn't always very detailed, they couldn't really include dialogue or any kind of interiority for the characters, obviously the author would have to step in and fill some of those details in. But Brown got kind of raked over the coals because he wasn't faithful enough. Readers were like, oh, he's changing too much. It's kind of the way we feel if we love a book and then we see it turned into a movie. A lot of times we're really sticklers for all the details being true and faithful and the same as they were in the book. And if we see deviations, or if we see the movie kind of creating new elements, sometimes we reject that because we're like, oh, that's not how it was in the book. So that's kind of how early readers were looking at The Power of Sympathy. They were comparing it to the newspaper articles and saying, look, Brown's changing this. That's not how it really happened. So they were almost using that against him. But again, Brown was just kind of a hack writer, and the novel wasn't well done anyway. The Coquette follows a similar formula, but Foster is just better at writing than Brown is. But she's doing kind of the same thing. So the basic elements of the plot that we see here is basically a recreation of real events that happened in Connecticut to a woman named Elizabeth Whitman in the 1780s. So the same kind of ripped from the headlines approach. And again, this is kind of a tradition in the early novel writing of the day to sort of use real events as a basis for the novel. A lot of sentimental fiction was like this. A lot of seduction tales were like this. So she's operating within pretty well-defined sort of categories here, but like Brown, she has to fill in details because the story of Elizabeth Whitman was not nearly as fleshed out and developed as what we see in the book. For example, the real-life seducer of Whitman, who got her pregnant and then abandoned her, his identity was never really known. There were some guesses, people speculated about who it might be, but nobody ever really knew for sure. So obviously here in The Coquette, we meet the seducer, we know the rake. He's one of the main characters. So the Peter Sanford character, that's totally a creation by Foster. Like that's all her. But Eliza is very much based on Elizabeth Whitman. Foster's even kept the initials the same. Eliza Wharton is based on Elizabeth Whitman. So going back to that notion of referentiality, this is what Gallagher means. A lot of early novel readers would have expected a character like Eliza to basically be a stand-in for a real-life figure like Elizabeth Whitman. And that is what Foster's doing, and a lot of writers were doing that in the 1790s. But a lot of scholars look at Charlotte Temple, written by Susanna Rowson a few years before The Coquette, and they say, okay, now we can pinpoint a moment, not that Rowson was the very first to do this, but we can see a more modern approach to referentiality in Charlotte Temple. And we're not going to read Charlotte Temple, but in the foreword, Rowson is addressing the reader, and she is trying to navigate this tricky thing that we're describing right now, this thin line between fiction and nonfiction. And she's wanting to distinguish her work from other sentimental novels of the time. So she's very clear with her readers. She's very explicit. She says, look, my story, Charlotte, and the other characters here, they are not directly based on real events or real people. She's very clear about that. Because she wants readers to understand that Charlotte is not supposed to be a stand-in for a real-life person. Instead, what Rowson says is Charlotte represents a lot of young girls. I've known a lot of young girls who have experienced what Charlotte experiences here. So now we have what Gallagher calls a sort of more modern conception of referentiality. And what Gallagher says is kind of confusing, but she says this is non-referentiality. This is how we understand characters to function today, in the modern day. We understand that characters aren't meant to always represent other individuals. Instead, like Charlotte, most characters are supposed to represent types. They're supposed to represent larger groups. And that's typically how we implicitly understand characters in realistic fiction. So we'll see a character and we're like, oh yeah, I know somebody like that. I know somebody like Sanford. But I understand that Sanford represents a type of man, not just one man, because there's a lot of them. Unfortunately, there's a lot of rakes in this world. Sanford's just one. He's representative of an entire class of people, an entire group of people. And that's how Charlotte works. She represents all innocent young girls who are pursued by sort of immoral rakes. So by doing that, by sort of making that slightly different move, Rowson, at least according to Gallagher, Rowson achieves a more modern effect. And she's also able to create a more popular book because now Charlotte has much greater representational power. She doesn't just stand in for one real life person. She represents an entire class of young women. So now any young woman can perhaps see herself in Charlotte. And like I told you guys last week, there was a real sort of fan culture that sprang up around that book. Even though readers understood on most levels that Charlotte was not real, they still had these kind of shrines put together in her honor. Some people would even go to graves that were said to be Charlotte. So again, maybe some people didn't fully understand. Some readers probably did think that Charlotte was a real person because that's still how a lot of people read novels back then. But at least in her preface, Rowson's trying to make a distinction. She's trying to explain to readers that, no, I'm not doing what William Hill Brown's doing. I'm telling a fictional story, but it's still realistic. It could happen. It does happen just like this every day to any number of anonymous young women. I'm just throwing some fictionality over these real things, and I'm giving you fictional characters, but this is supposed to represent larger truths, larger ideas, and again, the characters are supposed to represent larger classes of people. So that's pretty much all we need to know, but I hope you guys see that that is how novels sort of are supposed to work today. Again, not always. Certain historical novels are based on real things, and obviously if we're looking at sci-fi or fantasy, we're kind of leaving the realm of the realistic in some cases. But I think we're all familiar with this, right? With realistic fiction, we know that characters are supposed to represent a type of person, a class of person. And that makes them more powerful. That makes them more significant in a lot of ways. So that's kind of the argument that Gallagher makes. And, that this is a process that plays out in a lot of these early sentimental novels. They're all presented as plausible and they could be true. Some of them were true, some of them weren't. So it gets a little confusing, but just keep some of that in mind as you read this. As you read The Coquette, because again, in some ways, Foster is tapping into this older tradition that seems very old-fashioned to us, because we no longer need our characters to have that kind of old-fashioned, direct referentiality that they were supposed to have through much of the 1700s. But at the same time, Foster, I think, is a very interesting artist, and I think she's a better novel writer than Rowson because she inserts a lot of social commentary. She's really commenting on early American society and women's place within it. Rowson maybe indirectly touches on some of those topics, but one key difference, and I did mention that Rowson was originally from England, but she spent most of her adult life in America. Charlotte Temple, at least in the beginning of the book, it's set in England. Now, I believe they go to America because Charlotte's rake is a soldier in the British Army, but Charlotte is English, the rake is English, and a lot of the action of the book takes place in England. So even though it's considered largely an American book, it does have that older English setting. Whereas here in The Coquette, we are in Connecticut. We can tell by the place names, Hartford, New Haven. Those are still cities that you can go to in Connecticut. So we are in the era of the early republic. We are in early U.S. society. And as we follow Eliza's story, yes, it is based on real events, but Foster is fictionalizing a lot. Virtually all of the other characters outside of Eliza are pretty much her invention. And Eliza herself is a very interesting character. She is based on a real person, but she's very different from a lot of the other protagonists in sentimental novels, especially in seduction plots. She's a lot more complex. I would say she's a lot more self-aware. And unlike a lot of the other protagonists, she's not really deceived by the rake. She knows what Sanford is. And that's a really interesting thing about this book. All the characters pretty much know what Sanford is. So, again, you got to remember that the Coquette is steeped in this older tradition, not super old because novels weren't old yet, but these sentimental books, these seduction tales, they had been around for several decades by now. So Foster is counting on her readers being familiar with this type of novel. So I believe Davidson points this out in the introduction, but at one point, Sanford is referred to as a second Lovelace. And that reference might not mean anything to us, but Lovelace was a rake from an earlier sentimental novel published in England. I believe it was Clarissa by Samuel Richardson. Richardson's an important early novelist in England, and he mostly wrote seduction tales with female protagonists. So again, not only women wrote these books, they could also be penned by men, but they often centered around women characters, and other types of literature typically did not. So that was another, as we can imagine, that's a key distinction that was often made when defining sentimental literature. So Foster is assuming that her audience has read Richardson, that they've read his novels, they know that character, and this is a character in the book saying, hey, be careful of this guy. He's a rake. He's just like Lovelace. And Eliza, being smart and really nobody's fool, she kind of knows. I mean, she's not really deceived by Sanford. She doesn't think, at least not for very long, she doesn't think that he really intends to marry her, but he is courting her on some level. She's being courted, of course, by two suitors. And Sanford, at least initially, is more fun. And she simply enjoys his company more. But all along, she knows, I think deep down, and she even articulates it at times, she knows that he's trouble. And the other characters around her know that he is trouble. So she's an interesting character. She's very intelligent, very self-aware. As we learn early on, she's middle class. She's been raised middle class. So she's educated by the standards of the day. She's, sort of refined. She can play the piano. She can sing. She can dance. So these were the kinds of skills that a lot of middle class and upper class women would have sort of been armed with back then so that they could attract a husband. So there was a certain degree of education that women had access to, but it was largely centered on these sort of pleasing social graces that were perceived as good ways to attract men. So that's very much an interest here. Foster is examining the status of women in early U.S. society, and in a way that not many other books of the 1790s did. This was not a principal preoccupation of a lot of sentimental fiction. But, as I think I mentioned last week, sentimental fiction was often designed to deliver some kind of instruction, often thought of as like moral instruction, often geared towards young women. Sort of teaching young women how to avoid temptation, how to maintain their virtue, how to maintain their chastity in the face of all of these obstacles and these unscrupulous men. That was very much what Ralston says that she's doing in Charlotte Temple. That would have been the expected outcome here with Foster's novel as well. And I think as modern readers, we kind of reject the idea that all fiction needs to have a message or some kind of a moral. We don't necessarily expect that from every text, although we know that a lot of texts still do have those things. We don't demand it in every case, but back then, most novels would have been thought to deliver some kind of lesson, some kind of instruction. Again, novels were always sort of fighting against this charge of being like kind of disreputable, like not quite as respectable as older forms of literature like poetry or in some cases drama. So again, novels were a little bit defensive. There was often an attempt to justify their existence. Hey, this is true. This isn't just some salacious thing. This is true. And also, hey, this is going to teach you something. Like they're kind of trying to stake out some respectability, some kind of defined role in the literary marketplace. And although there were some struggles early on, you guys should recognize that novels took off pretty quickly. And by the 19th century, by the 1800s, novels had really surpassed those older forms of literature. And even today, we still see this. Novels probably are the most popular type of traditional literature. Novels are read more often now than poetry or plays. Short stories are also pretty often read. So these newer forms of prose fiction kind of lapped or surpassed those older forms. And part of that might have had to do with some of these early innovations that writers like Rouse and Foster were sort of carving out and creating. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense of kind of what's going on at this time in terms of literary production. But to go back to the Coquette in particular, I want you guys to kind of think a little bit about what message might be expressed here. Like, what is the message? What is the lesson? Because certainly, I think modern readers often recognize that Eliza is a bit headstrong. So I just want you guys to read the first half of the novel this week. So we might not know everything that happens to her yet. But sure, we can perhaps recognize that she is a little headstrong, maybe some might claim that she makes poor decisions, but what I think Foster is really doing here is trying to show us the very confined social status that Eliza possesses at this point in history. She is not presented with many options. She has Peter Sanford on one hand, the sort of handsome, cultured, charming rake who she knows is probably nothing but trouble, although he is pretty fun in the short term. And then on the other side, we have the Reverend Boyer, who is respectable and does offer stability. But, and you guys might disagree, I find Boyer to be boring and sort of condescending. And he's very self-righteous. And she simply does not want to be a reverend's wife. So Eliza is an interesting character, and we have to decide how we feel about her. I think we have a certain modern perspective today where we want young people to have choices. We want young people to experience different things and to find themselves, and we don't want to lock them in a little box. But of course, things were quite different in the 1790s. As Davidson points out in the intro, I'm going to get the phrasing wrong, but it's a very powerful moment, and it really nails what we see in the novel. She says that, throughout the book, Eliza is trying to exercise her freedom, only to find out that she has no freedom. And that's one of the key themes that kind of runs through this book, is that Eliza is confined and she knows it. I mean, she's smart enough to understand the situation that she's in, but she rejects it. She rejects the choice that's being forced upon her, because the choice is either Sanford or Boyer. Either marry the respectable clergyman and have a respectable middle-class life, and that's what everybody around her obviously wants her to do, or pick Sanford and have some short-term fun only to be ruined in the long run. Not a great choice. She isn't presented with a lot of appealing options. So she balks at that in the way that a lot of modern people would. She just doesn't like it. She's not okay with the fact that those are her only options. And her friends and her mother are all like, hey, what's the big deal? Boyer's a good choice. He's a good match. And by the standards of the day, he is. He is. I mean, they're not wrong. He offers a lot of stability, financial security, and that middle class respectability. And Sanford's not going to give her any of that because obviously he doesn't want to marry her. He just wants to have fun and sleep with her. And again, she knows that. I mean, she becomes aware of that if she's not from the start. So that's not a mystery really to anyone. But Boyer doesn't represent a far superior choice in her mind because she doesn't want to be the wife of a minister. She's very vivacious, she's outgoing, she's talented, and she's young. So again, in our modern society, we want young people to have an opportunity to be young. And back in the 1790s, that was fine for men, of course. Men could have a lot of experiences. Men could be sexually promiscuous. Men could wait a little while before embarking on marriage and fatherhood, but not women, as we know. There was certainly a double standard, and women just didn't have access to really any of those things. As Davidson says, they did not have freedom the way we would define freedom today. But what's so interesting to me about Eliza is her social status. It's not like she's lower class. She's not economically disadvantaged growing up. In many ways, she has a certain degree of privilege. I mean, she is white. She's educated. And her father, like Boyer, was a minister. He was a clergyman, so they weren't wealthy. It's important to remember what her class status is. She's middle class. She's respectable, she's educated, but there is a limit to what she has. Her family's not wealthy. So I can't remember where we learned this, but at some point in the book, we hear about her brother. I don't think we ever meet him, but she has a brother. So when her father dies, whatever money he saved, whatever land they might own, whatever inheritance he might have to pass along, it's all going to the son. It's not going to Eliza. You know, she knows that. Everybody knows that. It's going to the male heir. So even though she grew up in relative comfort, Eliza's not getting any money from her parents when they die. She's got to find another man to provide for her. That's simply the situation that she finds herself in. And other characters don't think much about it. You know, in her letters from Lucy, in her conversations with her mother, you know, we hear the matter-of-fact way that those characters address the situation. They're just like, yeah, Boyer's a pretty good pick. You know, you'll have a pretty nice house. You can pop out some kids. You know, he's going to be a stable, reliable guy. What's the problem? Right? There's a very telling conversation with her mom at some point. I can't quite remember what letter it's in, but she's kind of talking to her mom about this choice, and her mom's like, well, you're going to have to be dependent on some man, so Boyer's not a bad choice when you think about it like that. And I also wanted to point you guys to something that her friend Lucy says. This is in letter 15 at the bottom of page 30, going up to the top of page 31. It's a really telling quote, and I just love the sort of circuitous way that Lucy makes the point, but if we dissect the language, I think we can see what she's saying here very clearly. So she's responding to Eliza, who's been kind of talking about freedom and wanting a certain degree of independence. And remember her situation as when we first meet her. She was already engaged to marry that old guy who dies before they have a chance to get married, but she has to be his nurse. You know, she's a teenager. She has to play nurse to this guy and sit by his bedside as he slowly dies. And that's her fiance. So right off the bat, we know that for her family, it's just a matter of marrying her off. Let's just find a respectable man to be her husband so she's taken care of. That's really the only destiny that she has. And that's what Lucy's trying to say here. She says, "You are indeed very tenacious of your freedom, as you call it, but that is a play about words." Kind of a cutting remark there. That is a play about words. A man of Mr. Boyer's honor and good sense will never abridge any privileges which virtue can claim. So let's unpack that quote a little bit, because obviously the language is old-fashioned, but I think we can see what Lucy's getting at here. She's saying, look, all your talk about freedom is meaningless, and she's not wrong. She says your talk about freedom, you're just playing with words. That's all it is. And if we actually think about that statement, it's true. Because as Davidson points out, women like Lucy and Eliza, they didn't have any freedom to speak of. So Eliza talking about freedom, to Lucy's mind, to Lucy's more practical mind, it is a bit frivolous. And it's kind of meaningless, because for them, all freedom can be is a word. It's not going to be reality. So Lucy's not wrong about that, but she's being a little bit mean, perhaps. And then she says, a man of Mr. Boyer's honor and good sense will never abridge, never shorten, never limit the privileges which virtue can claim. So notice that qualifier. She's saying, look, a guy like Boyer, who's not violent, not a drunk, not cruel, a respectable middle-class man like Boyer, he's not going to take away any privileges from you, at least not any virtuous privileges. So again, we see that Lucy's criticizing Eliza here. And as Eliza admits, she likes to dance, she likes to go to parties, she likes to be around new people. She likes to have new experiences. But it's not like she's doing the things that teenagers do today. Like, she's not getting drunk. She's not engaging in what we would call reckless behavior. She's just socializing. She just likes to go to social gatherings and maybe dance with a good-looking guy, which I think to most modern people seems fairly innocent. But again, it's the 1790s, and standards are very different. So Lucy's basically saying, Boyer's not going to take away any virtuous privileges that you should enjoy. And she doesn't give any examples, but I'm guessing, like, I don't know, knitting scarves, hosting the church ladies after a Sunday service, cooking a meal for the neighborhood guys, I don't know, popping out 8 or 9 kids and maybe hoping that half of them live. You know, I guess those would be the privileges that Lucy's talking about, but also managing a household, right? I mean, there was a certain degree of middle-class comfort that would come along with a marriage to Boyer. You'd have a house, and the house would sort of be your domain as the wife. You could decorate. You would kind of decide where the couch gets to go. You get to decide the layout of your kitchen. These are the privileges that Lucy's talking about. These are the things that Eliza can have with Boyer. But the things that she can't have are the privileges that aren't virtuous. And for Lucy, that would mean dancing. That would mean going to the theater with an unmarried man. That would mean being alone, basically, with an unmarried man, even if all you're doing is chatting. Like, that was scandalous. If you were alone, if you're a single woman and he's a single man and you're alone together with no chaperone, no supervision, that's scandalous, even if you're not doing so much as even putting your hands on one another. So we'll see an example of that perhaps a little bit later on. So very telling moment here, very telling quote from Lucy. But again, we can, I think as modern people, we sort of reject the logic. We reject this really moralistic sort of tone that Lucy strikes here, but she's not wrong according to the standards of the day. She's not wrong in saying that Boyer is pretty much the best that Eliza can hope for. At another point in the narrative, she even says that. I can't remember what letter that is, but she says, no offense, but Boyer's the best you're going to do. And that's not because of any defect that Eliza possesses. That's just because Eliza's middle class. He's middle class. He's just the kind of guy that she's intended to marry, right? He's a little bit like her father. So he can give her the kind of life that her mother enjoyed, the kind of life that, she was brought up in. And that to everybody else is like, hey, it's pretty good. So it's just really weird to think about because the middle class status does afford her certain privileges, I guess the virtuous ones, but she's so confined. And we see this throughout the novel. And we understand this just from a basic understanding of history, right? Middle class women during this time period, they would not work. The only women who worked at this point in the early republic would be lower class women, poor women. Maybe in some cases widows whose husbands were long gone and they lived alone. Maybe they would take in some washing or do some midwifing. I don't know. Those were also typically done, though, by lower class women. But there would be some exceptions where a woman who was alone because of socially acceptable circumstances could maybe take in some work and mostly work from home. But the whole idea of a middle class woman working or living alone, being independent at all, would have been very strange and not really socially acceptable. So Eliza doesn't have to necessarily face some of the financial hardships or some of the lack of stability that lower class women would experience. She's not being asked to work and spend all of her days kind of doing menial labor, but at the same time, she has such limited options. She has to find a husband who can provide. That's the ticket to a middle class, comfortable life. And if you choose wrong, if you're in her position and you make the wrong choice, as many seduction plots point out, the consequences could be very disastrous. So I'll stop there. Next week, we'll talk more about the book itself. Hopefully everybody is finished reading by next week. Again, it's not a very long novel, only about 160 pages or so, plus the short intro by Kathy Davidson. So it's kind of hard to get too far into the novel without giving away some spoilers. So next week we'll talk more completely about what happens to Eliza, the choices that she makes, and the logic that she sort of uses. Because I would argue that a lot of things are kind of outside of her control, at least the way they're presented by Foster. There are several pivotal moments in the plot where it seems like Eliza is kind of on the verge of making the right choice. She's on the the right choice as it would be defined back then, not necessarily what we think of as the right choice. She seems on the verge several times, but then these different things happen. Sometimes these external factors seem to play a big part, and she might not always respond to them in the most pragmatic way, but I want to explore some of those moments, some of those pivotal turning points in the plot. And just a final thing to remember, Foster originally published this novel anonymously. So maybe part of the reason why it never got the attention that Charlotte Temple did, and it wasn't studied for a long time. Again, Davidson helped to change that in more recent decades, but Foster's name did not appear on the title page of the novel until, I believe, 1866, which was like 20 years after Foster had died. So she never got recognition for this during her lifetime. And unlike Rowson, who I mentioned last week was an actress and she opened schools for girls and she was kind of a public figure, a little bit of a celebrity. Foster very much not. She was married to a minister. That should sound familiar. She was a wife and a mother. She was from Connecticut, I believe, or she might have been born in Massachusetts, but I think she lived in Connecticut, at least at some point. I don't know, those states are close together anyway. So she was married to a minister, wrote most of her stuff anonymously, and only now, and we're the last, few decades, have we really begun to sort of appreciate her contributions to early American lit. All right, so that's it for today. We'll come back next week and get a little bit deeper into the novel.